We're sitting here with Todd Fryhover, who is the president of the Washington Apple Commission here in Wenatchee at their main offices here in Old Station area. We asked Todd to join us to talk about the impacts, possible impacts to the tree fruit industry if indeed the Trump administration goes ahead with imposing tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum. The Washington apple growers are highly dependent on foreign trade, and certainly with record harvests over the last few years, it becomes even more critical to have that export trade. And I'm sure you would agree with that, Todd. And obviously some concerns that if those tariffs go forward, as the Trump administration appears to be committed to at this point, what impact that's going to have on apple growers here in Washington State.
Right, you're absolutely right, Steve. You know, the Washington apple industry, as maybe some of your viewers don't realize, is heavily dependent upon trade. A third of our product goes to over 60 countries around the world. And this year we expect to ship over 40 million bushels to those 60 markets. So we're very heavily dependent upon trade, and it really is the backbone to keeping growers successful financially to have those outlets in those foreign markets. And China, of course, is one of those key markets, especially when you look at value plus. There's a willingness to pay more money for better product, and they take a large volume, and having been in the top 5 of our markets, export markets, in the last several years. So it's very key to our programs.
So what are we looking at in terms of shipments to like China and those countries that might be subject to tariffs for steel and aluminum, let's say?
Yeah, well, looking at China, we're about 1.7 to 2.5 million cartons annually into China and Hong Kong. You know, with 1997 obviously in the rearview mirror, we look at China and Hong Kong as one. So it's a very integral market when we think about our exports. You know, other areas, of course, are Canada and Mexico when we talk about the steel and the aluminum trade, and those two markets make up 40% of all of our exports when combined together. So any kind of trade disruption into any one of those 3 markets, or all 3, would be very detrimental to the health and well-being of the growers of Washington State. Interesting.
Let's talk about the marketing year that we're just leaving now in 2016, 2017. How's that coming along right now?
So
the shipping and
for this crop year. Okay, so you know, things are going okay. You know, when we look at the export, we obviously compare against previous years, and last year's the year that's the most comparative for us. And we're ahead. We're about 7% ahead on exports where we were last year, so we feel fairly comfortable about that. That's a real good sign. I think the key factor is are we moving enough product offshore to protect our domestic market, which takes 70% of our product roughly. And it appears that we are, and we're moving in the right direction. So we're happy with our programs thus far.
In terms of what we face, in terms of tariffs that are imposed by foreign countries,
right?
What level of that activity do we see?
Right. Probably unknown to most people is there are a lot of countries that have tariffs on apples going into their particular destinations. You know, to give you an example, Mexico and Canada are at 0, but Mexico hasn't always been at 0. It's been as high as 43.5% in the past, but it's at 0 today. To show you the other side of the equation, we have a 50% duty on apples going into India, and that's on the CNF value. So that's a very substantial duty, and the highest duty that we do have. Currently in China, we have a 10% duty on the apples, and then a 10% value-added tax. So there's a 20% increase in cost to the consumer. But everybody is subject to the value-added tax. The duty is specific to the United States.
I guess the question would be, it's obvious that there is an imbalance in those countries.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that? Mm-hmm. How do you rectify that situation? I mean, obviously the president is looking at ways to,
right,
to provide not just free trade, but fair trade.
Right.
How do you address that?
Right. I think in our industry, we have avenues to address this with our congressional people first. So we'll get a hold of Dan Newhouse or Senator Reichert or Murray or Cantwell, and we'll voice our opinions directly with them, showing them cause and effect. You know, these trade barriers, these high duties are reducing our ability to export more product. That's obviously the first stage. And then we'll move up the food chain, so to speak. We'll talk to the United States Trade Representative and have conversations with them about the lack of access and the hampering to our particular access that these duties pose. And then eventually what we hope for is getting our Washington, D.C. representation together to sign on to letters and try to change these things as they move forward. But it's a very, very slow process for us, and I think we need to remember, in the context of trade, Apple's is really a minor player. We think of ourselves as a major player, but frankly, it's more about, you know, airplanes and, you know, and computer software and things of that nature. The Apple category, or agriculture in general, doesn't have a big say.
But in terms of the impacts on the economy of central Washington,
Huge.
It's critical.
It's huge, yeah. When you start looking at the Washington Apple industry and the effect to the Washington state economy, indirect and direct inputs are somewhere around $10 billion. Farm gate value is around $3 billion just on apples, and that's not including pears and cherries, which obviously we're the largest producers of as well.
President Trump appears to be using, I think, these tariffs as a way to leverage maybe some changes in some of the trade agreements, such as NAFTA or even the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which I noticed in the news recently that has just been authorized by the countries that are signed on to that.
That's
They're hoping that the United States comes into the fold at some point in time in the future.
Right.
But obviously, you would say that NAFTA has been good for the Apple industry.
I think there's no question as far as the Apple industry is concerned, and agriculture in general, and really to the consuming public when you start looking at fruits and vegetables and things of that nature. NAFTA has been critical to the success of our industry for sure. And in general, I think trade agreements are always positive. We don't have any duties on products coming here into the United States. So we're always trying to reduce or to eliminate those duties at the foreign side. And that's what NAFTA does. That's what TPP, that you alluded to earlier, has done with those 11 countries that have rectified that agreement. It's what CAFTA has done with the Central American countries. It's with CORUS, with the Korean agreement. They're all about reducing barriers to trade. So all those free trade agreements are excellent, although we're seeing no movement on bilateral agreements, one-on-one, or collective agreements like TPP that we lost out on, or NAFTA, which is currently under renegotiation.
Okay, so at this point, how's it looking for this year in terms of our sales overseas? We had a pretty big crop this year, and how are things panning out here?
Well, I think this year looks okay. You know, these trade agreements, if they do come to fruition and they do close some markets, won't happen immediately. It takes time. Things get negotiated. There's retaliation that takes place. So I think for the rest of the season on the export front, I think we're good. Access is, for the most part, unfettered. I think the availability, as you allude to with these larger crops, is creating economic pressure. I think that growers need to understand that you know, only certain grades of fruit and certain varieties have more preference than others do, and certain sizes obviously too. You can't grow 2 1/4-inch apples and expect to be profitable. You know, you need to have 3-inch apples, and you need to have premium grades, and that's really becoming apparent because we are in a world supply situation. China produces 50% of all the apples in the world. They affect us.
Their industry has really developed since I
Absolutely.
was back there in the mid-90s.
Absolutely. You know, there's a significant player. The European Union is 4 times the size of the state of Washington, yet they only have less than twice the amount of people. So there's a lot of competition in the Northern Hemisphere, and we really are world-bound.
And you cannot really make up for that foreign trade by increasing domestic sales, can you?
No, but I will say this, you're right. Domestic consumption is static at best. We're at around 16 to 17 pounds per capita consumption. However, these new varieties that are being developed, we're seeing movement in that per capita consumption. The dilemma is, of course, those are all at higher dollar values too. So it's really economics, the economics of the consumer that's driving that. We still have quite a few people in this country, regrettably, that can't afford those apples. So it's going to be a slow process.
What are you looking at in terms of the foreign market in terms of their preference for varieties and that type
Right.
of thing? Obviously,
Sure.
we have a quality product, but
Right.
what is it that they're looking for?
Right. Well, I think the first thing that consumers overseas are looking for is taste. Are they a sweet palate? Are they a tart palate? I mean, you can't send an apple that's tart into a sweet market and expect to be successful. And just as important, I think, is texture. People are looking for a crunch. They want a good, hard, firm apple. That's what they're looking for. They don't want something that's going to be soft and mushy. And then the third thing, and still is very important, is people do buy with their eyes still. So coloration really makes it important. They really want that perfect apple. And there are niche, markets out there where they can pay for it. It's just how fast we're growing those new varieties and the expectations from a price standpoint, which are going to be difficult to reach in foreign markets.
Again, we're talking with Todd Fryhover with the Washington Apple Commission here in Wenatchee, and I guess in closing, unless you have something else to add, I would ask you if you had a direct line to the White House right now and you had the ear of the president,
Right.
what message would you have for him?
Well, the message would be don't break anything that's already working. There's no reason on the agricultural side to take NAFTA down. It works well, it works to the benefit of consumers and producers, and it has functioned very well since inception over 24 years ago. And please, more free trade agreements, more free access, less duties. That's really where we need to go as an industry.
I know you don't want to be put into a position of competing with Alcoa right now, but
Right.
obviously
Right.
tariffs that might be good for maybe resuming production at the Wenatchee smelter
Sure.
would not necessarily be good for the tree fruit industry.
Not necessarily, but Alcoa is a multinational company. They have holdings in Brazil and in Canada and other places as well. So they're not going to take the bait on what might be a short-term solution as well. I grew up in my family. My stepfather was an Alcoan, so we're very cognizant of the importance of that industry and what it has been to the Wenatchee Valley, and we'd love to see it come back. There's no question, but not at the expense of the growers that I represent.
That's true.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Todd,
Sure.
for taking time to talk
Sure.
to us. Appreciate
My
it.
welcome, Steve. Thank you.
You bet.